Let's talk about some mighty green armoured space marines, artisan crafted weaponry and the fiery wrath of the dragon, with some ideas for starting a Salamanders army in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Salamanders, and for this video I thought we'd do an overview of collecting the chapter in Warhammer 40k, a few ideas as to the pros and cons of collecting Salamanders specifically, some ideas for planning out an army and a bunch of Space Marine discount bundles to get started with, then go on to options to expand from there, and look at their unique character datasheets, Firestorm Assault Force, and a bunch of units that might do a bit better in that, before rounding up with one example army list. Loads to talk about for the boys in green, so let's jump straight into it. First up, why might you want to collect Salamanders in Warhammer 40k 10th edition? In the lore, the Salamanders are the 18th Legion of Space Marines, a loyalist legion during the Heresy under their Primarch Vulcan, who were notably brutally ambushed by the traitor Marines and took enormous losses at the Isfahan drop site massacre. The Salamanders are the sons of Vulcan the Perpetual, one of the single most mighty and powerful of the Primarchs with the seeming ability to never die. He was last seen at the climax of the War of the Beast post-Heresy, lost in an explosion of gargantuan proportions, but given his lore it's unlikely that he perished in such an explosion and may well be out there somewhere in the galaxy to return to Warhammer 40k in due course. It's believed that if the Forge Fathers of the Salamanders are able to collect the great relics that Vulcan left for them, he will eventually deem them worthy of his return. In more modern day 40k, their homeworld is the volcanic death world of Nocturne, a very difficult place to survive, its inhabitants notable for their onyx black skin and bright red eyes, thought to be a reaction to the radiation of their homeworld. Their planet is home to great mineral resources though, and with them they craft the very best arms of war. A great many master artisans reside amongst the chapter and on the planet. Great thunderhammers are common in their army, and when they make war they tend to make a great use of flamers and melter weapons, the chapter preferring the utter destruction of the enemy that only the close range immolation will bring, or very wrath of the dragon there. Despite using some incredibly powerful weaponry, the Salamanders are also known to be a bit more humanitarian and empathetic to the plight of mortals than the vast majority of Space Marines. Often the Astartes won't really care too much about the plight of regular humans, seeing as their only job to serve the big picture, and might not go to great lengths to ensure the safety of civilians or the evacuation of planets, unless it will definitely help the Imperium overall. It is kind of nice to have an army that maybe acts a little bit more like the good guys than a fair few armies in 40k. For the army's miniature range, as with the rest of the Space Marine chapters in 40k, Salamanders have access to the Great Big Space Marine range, fairly widely known as the biggest and most frequently updated of any of the armies out there. Far more unit choices than most, though compared with a few of the divergent chapters, the Salamanders don't have as many things to add to their theme, one upgrade sprue and 2 character miniatures, though paint style and unit choices can add a lot of theme as well. They can find some further themed units and upgrades from their Horus Heresy range if desired, including the Primarch Vulcan if you did want to paint him up, and as ever with Space Marines, I would bear the entire Firstborn Primaris thing in mind. It seems on the cards that all the kits beyond the recent Primaris era will gradually be phased out over time, so it might not be the best idea to go super heavy on picking loads of them up. For the core Space Marine range, you can have all the normal toys like standard Space Marines with bolt rifles, for intercessors, assault intercessors, and the rest, heavily armoured elites like aggressors, which are often quite favoured by Salamanders players. Lots of nice close range flamethrower goodness there. There's bigger war machines such as the Indomitable Redemptor Dreadnought, and Primaris Graph transports to get your troopers from A to B such as the Repulsor. For the Salamanders' unique choices, here you can see their upgrade sprue on the left, a bunch of shoulder pads with icons on, sporting their all very draconic chapter symbol, plus a couple of flaming braziers, some different sculpted heads, and some thunderhammers. Otherwise, here are their 2 unique characters, Adrax Agatone, the plastic Primaris sculpt with a thunderhammer, Malleus Noctum, and a handflamer, and the older resin sculpt of the Forge Father Vulcan Heston, tasked with recovering the great relics and artifacts of Vulcan and fighting with some of them, including his spear and cloak. As mentioned, the Salamanders do have a few themed things from the Horus Heresy range, Legion Pyroclasts with some big flamethrowers, or their Fire Drake Terminators with thunderhammers and storm shields. They're made of Forge World resin, so are going to run you a lot more expensive compared with plastic things, but if you really like the theme and sculpt of the models, it could be an okay investment. And finally, as mentioned, we have Vulcan himself. If you do want to paint up a sculpt of the Primarch, Again, he's for Horus Heresy and is sculpted in resin. I guess in contemporary 40k you could run him with rules for Rabute Gilliman, though I guess rules as written you couldn't field him in the same army as one of the Salamander's unique characters. Price-wise, Space Marines and Salamanders don't tend to be the worst for Warhammer 40k as it goes. Marines tend to be fairly heavy on the elite infantry, so you don't need quite as many of them as some armies, and that usually goes hand in hand with not being the most expensive. Plus they do tend to have a few more discount deals going for them than most other things, edition release boxes and various different combat patrols and other things that they've built up over the years, plus usually getting a Christmas battle force of one sort or another. Obviously that's all relative to Warhammer in general though, which is often regarded as a pretty expensive hobby. In terms of gameplay, the Salamanders fight with rules from the core Codex Space Marines. Maybe classically they're perhaps a little bit more range focused versus melee, as mentioned very much enjoying close range shooting with Melter and Flamer, but they absolutely do both, and laying about the enemy with fancy power weapons or thunder hammers is well within their remit. They have their own themed detachment in the Firestorm Assault Force, which I'll go into in a bigger way towards the end of the video. I'd rate both Vulcan Hestan and Adrex Agaton pretty good characters in their own ways. Again, I'll focus on them in a second. And if you want to mix things up, then Games Workshop basically made it so paint doesn't really matter too much in 10th edition 40k. You can have your force painted up as Salamanders and still use things like the Gladius Task Force or the Ironstorm Spearhead if you want to, so you don't have to be locked into one way of fighting and one way only. Currently in the wider game of 40k, Space Marines are generally considered pretty underpowered unfortunately. It's been a problem for them since 10th edition came out, lots of standout combos being nerfed, and often partly the fault of divergent chapters like Blood Angels and Friends stealing their thunder. I personally wouldn't say that they're so bad that they're out of the running with a good player with an optimised list though. Ironstorm, Gladius, Firestorm and Vanguard can all do well enough, and absolutely certainly if you're playing in a more casual environment. And perhaps more importantly than that, Games Workshop do tend to adjust balance for 40k all the time. Just because an army is weak at one point doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be in a few months' time. In any case though, if you want an army of green armoured, powerful Space Marines that like to immolate their foe with heavy fire, the Salamanders might be the army for you. If you do decide to go with Salamanders, you could potentially think about planning out a rough 1000 point or 2000 point army list, likely using New Recruits, Battlescribe or maybe Warhammer's app. And there's definitely a whole bunch of different ways in which you could collect an army, either building balanced around the Space Marine units that you like the feel of, or going with some sort of overarching theme. You could maybe build an army that's going specifically for, say, the Firestorm Assault Force, try and take all the units that will be effective in that, which I think does have quite good overlap with the iconic Salamanders units. Or just build up the army a bit more gradually, bit by bit, adding units that just really appeal to you in terms of either the looks, lore or gameplay, and allow things to grow a bit more organically. For the most iconic things that Salamanders might tend to go in for, Melted and Flamer units are perhaps the most obvious one. Maybe examples of that in the current range could be things like the Eradicator Squad, the Flamestorm Aggressors, Infernus Marines or the Land Raider Redeemer. And for assault close combat units, they're generally a bit better known for more mighty, slower moving melee units with a lot of toughness. Maybe things like a Terminator Assault Squad could be an obvious one, even if that one does feel like it's a miniature kit that's due an update at some stage. Blade Guard veterans might fit the bill as well quite well though, fairly resilient with their shields and a lot of might. Bonus points for giving anything else Hand Flamers or Thunder Hammers, which would be probably their more iconic Sergeant or Captain style gear if they can take them. Cool combi weapons are right up their street as well. I have seen some affinity with Salamander's armies maybe going a little bit more Gravis heavy than other chapters. I guess the Aggressors and Eradicators both having Flamer and Melter gear helps with that a bit, and big chunky slower moving armour does seem to be in the Salamander's kind of style. In any case, whichever way you're going with a Space Marine force, an early part in the decision process could be to paint up a test miniature. Given 10th edition and them being pretty readily available, something like a standard Infernus Marine really might not be the worst start, basically a standard Primaris Intercessor but with a Flamer instead. Something more standard like an Intercessor or an Assault Intercessor could also be absolutely fine though. Usually when you're starting a project for an army it's worth just having a play around with paint schemes on one individual model, and just decide whether or not you like the look of the green and the different detailing that you're doing on them, so that if you did need to redo it because you didn't really like the first attempt, it's not on something that's an enormous great big undertaking like a centerpiece character or a vehicle. There's loads of guides here on YouTube for that if you wanted to seek them out. Games Workshop themselves have made some, and it seems to be fairly common to give them sort of glowing orange detailing on things like power weapons. That feels like it goes quite well with their colour palette and also plays into their whole fiery motif that they have going on. You don't necessarily have to paint them green if you don't want to. You could go with one of the colour schemes of the Salamanders successor chapters, which they don't have an enormous amount of, but they do have some. And given that it's a big galaxy in Warhammer 40k, you could certainly make up your own. For chapter logos and things, you could potentially use transfers if you'd like to. Standard Space Marine kits tend to have some, though you might find more from the Salamanders upgrade sprue. That'll give you some sculpted shoulder pads as well, and plenty of 3D printing creators do make things that have suitable chapter logos that you could stick onto shoulder pads if you wanted to. For first purchases for a Salamander Space Marine army, I'd likely start with one of the Space Marine discount sets. If going for the Combat Patrol, then that'd be getting it via the starter set for 40k, but both Leviathan and one of the other Combat Patrols or discount offerings could be interesting. And if you just want to dip a toe in the faction with minimal investment, maybe a basic unit such as some Intercessors could be a fine enough place to start. Here's the Combat Patrol set for Space Marines. This is the one that was based off the Leviathan miniatures, monopost sculpts for Terminator Captain and Librarian, 5 Terminators and their pet Teleport Homer, and then 5 Infernus Marines, all very on brand for Salamanders with their Flamers. As it goes, I think it's a reasonable enough mix of units to start the game with, maybe a little bit weird in having 2 characters but only 1 Terminator squad to attach them to. So you'd often need either another squad of Terminators, or to run one solo, or to not run one, which maybe is one downside. If you were picking these ones up though, I'd certainly go through the 40k starter sets, as it basically means that you get literally the exact same miniatures, but cheaper and with free Tyranids. The main 40k starter set would be the one to go for if you're just interested in miniatures alone, and ideally split it with a Tyranid player and try and get all those units for £32, picking up the Librarian separately if you want him. There's also the Ultimate starter set available as well. That kind of depends as to whether or not you want the extras that come with that, a bit of terrain and a rulebook. As ever with buying 40k miniatures, bear in mind the different options that you have. Direct from Games Workshop's Warhammer web store is generally the most reliable but also the most expensive, and most of the time there's usually no reason not to buy from a discount retailer, either a friendly local gaming store or an online discount retailer. Loads of them out there, but I do have a bunch of channel affiliate ones linked in the video description that offer direct discounts versus Games Workshop. Just for a few examples of these, there's Element Games in the UK for 15% off Warhammer, Gap Games in Australia for 21% off, Fenris Workshop for 10% off in Canada, 15% off for Wargame Portal in the USA, and 16% off for Tash and Geldeep in the EU. Loads of other good ones out there if you give it a Google, but a massive thank you to any people using these ones on the regular. It does help to support the channel and keep the videos coming. Beyond that though, Space Marines are a very widely collected and followed army, and you'll often find lots of them coming up online on eBay. Quality and pricing can be variable, but you can save a fair bit of money and time of assembly versus new and unpainted miniatures, and often that can be well worth the trade-off. Sometimes kits that appear in the starter sets can go particularly commonly cheaply there as well. If you wanted to get new Infernus Marines, then in general in 10th edition they tend to sell very cheaply on eBay. Otherwise you could check out 3D printing creators or third-party manufacturers. Lots of alternative sculpts and details and things exist for various 40k chapters. These ones not very official, but they often do a great job of filling gaps that Games Workshop leave, often offering chapter markings and things for a fraction of the price of the upgrade sprue, and some other fun cool themed war gear and shields and things. Otherwise, for getting started with an army, I'll just run through a few of the other Space Marine discounts. The Leviathan box set was the launch box of 10th edition and was one of the best deals that Games Workshop's made in recent time for the miniatures contained. Again, I feel like it's pretty well up the street of Salamanders. Nothing really feels desperately out of place for them. Lots of Infernus Marines, and the Stern Guard certainly go with their sort of artisan crafted combi weapon sort of vibe. In general, this doesn't tend to be on sale from direct retailers very much around the world anymore, but you can often find either box halves or individual units going for pretty reasonable prices on eBay or Amazon, and could be a pretty good option to weigh up against other things. If you can get the Space Marine half of things for a similar sort of price to a Combat Patrol, it does contain a lot more miniatures than a Combat Patrol, though I would bear in mind that these are monopose ones. Speaking of the other Space Marine Combat Patrol ones, the Dark Angels one could be relevant. This one gets you 10 Intercessors, 3 Blade Guard, 5 Hellblasters, and a Gravis Captain. Not bad for fleshing out the Space Marine Infantry at a discount versus normal. Though the amount off isn't enormous, it's around about 20% off, though I feel like the Gravis Captain could be useful for Salamanders. Often people want to pick up some aggressors for Flamestorm gauntlets. The Space Wolf one is another option. Intercessors, Reavers, the Invictor Warsuits, and a themed Space Wolf battle leader here. I'd probably rate that as less appealing than the Dark Angels for Salamanders personally, but if the Invicta particularly appeals to you, it could be worth a look. On the Games Workshop web store, there's the Vanguard Task Force as well. This one's a Phobos themed box with some infiltrators, eliminators, suppressors, and a Phobos lieutenant. Again, a pretty reasonable way to expand the army at a slight budget. And again, monopose miniatures here, so no options for Lance Fusils on your eliminators, for example. Finally, for theoretical discount deals, I might as well mention the Age of Darkness Horus Heresy box set. This one's a bit more left field, as it's miniatures that apply to the Horus Heresy game setting as opposed to 40k, but most of them can be press ganged into work for 40k units in one way or another. Count the Contemptor as a regular dreadnought, the Spartan as a Land Raider, and the Tactical Marines as intercessors. At least money for the points, it's one of the best deals for Space Marines out there. You do just commit to a rather Heresy era aesthetic for your Space Marine army though, which is only going to appeal to a few people out there. Moving on to expanding the army, I thought it would be worth focusing on the Salamanders special characters, and first up for 100 points we have Vulcan Hestan, Guardian of the Relics. He's a firstborn miniature with a fine cast model, so compared with most, it's maybe a little bit less guarantees to survive into the extreme long term. Though it was kind of notable that Games Workshop didn't choose to retire him with the 10th edition codex, and it makes me wonder whether or not a plastic update for him might come at some stage. In any case though, I feel like his stats add a lot of Salamander's theme. He gets a great big heavy flamer with d6 plus 3 shots at strength 6, a spear of Vulcan for some fairly nice quality melee in close combat, a 2+ save with feel no pain for some Salamander's toughness, and his most interesting and impactful special rule is his Forge Father one. In your shooting phase you get to select one enemy unit within 24 inches, and then all of your units armed with melter weapons or torrent weapons gets to reroll wound rolls against that target. That's really quite a big one and can give a massive damage boost to units that couldn't otherwise get that. The main downside being that it doesn't help things that were already twin linked, so only a few units are super relevant for it. The Land Raider Redeemer is quite a big one with those scary Flamestorm cannons, and Infernus Marines can make good use, and even Eradicators could find this very useful if they happen to find themselves shooting against something that isn't a monster or vehicle. The other part of his rule is quite a fun one too, I think. If he goes on to a midfield objective that you've nominated at the start of the battle, he goes up to objective control 10, so some very sturdy presence there, a leadership of 5 and a feel no pain 4+. It seems to be quite in fashion to have him running with company heroes, marching up the board with a pretty tough unit, and taking an objective point while marking out other targets for other close range fire. The other Salamanders character is Adrax Agatone, a unique captain fighting with a slightly less potent flamer in Drakis, and Malleus Noctum for a very hard-hitting Thunderhammer at strength 10, AP 2, damage 3. And when you're leading a unit you get to reroll the wound roll with him and his charges, so that makes him extra nice for running with Blade Guard veterans, who maybe have their biggest weakness in struggling to wound the enemy with strength 5 weapons, even if they do have okay AP and damage. Feels like as a beatstick character alongside a Blade Guard squad he's hard to go too far wrong with. I think it's quite a fun plastic miniature as well, oozing with lots and lots of Salamander's details. Otherwise for their unique stuff, here's their upgrade sprue, £18 or $30 for this one. You get hand flamers, thunderhammers, a bunch of chapter icons, and some dedicated Salamanders transfer sheets that could be handy for vehicles and troops. Quite nice for adding a little bit of theme to armies, though would bear in mind that if you're trying to buy these for sculpted shoulder pads for every single squad in your army, you probably are going to be paying a significant amount extra. Some tend to like these a bit more than others. Lots of people are more than happy with transfers or doing their own chapter symbols for shoulder iconography. Otherwise, for ideas to expand an army, I feel like Eradicators fit quite well with the Salamanders. They basically just do one job really well in solid anti-tank for Space Marine armies. The main disadvantages are they're slow moving and kind of short ranged, but that's really not that big a problem in the Firestorm Assault Force if you're using it. Advance and shoot helps a lot. Transports like the Repulsor can help get them there, and getting the +1 strength within 12 inches helps out a lot as well, going to strength 10. If you are getting those, you could also consider the Honoured of the Chapter box set as an alternative. This one's rather unfortunately roughly the same price as a Combat Patrol. It depends whether or not the difference between the Eradicator kit and the Honoured of the Chapter box is worth 3 extra Blade Guard, a Judiciar and a Chaplain, plus that Blade Guard Ancient miniature as well. For the price it's not really all that many models for the money, but it does mean that you get quite a few characters I guess. Otherwise, for bringing some iconic Salamanders flame to the table, the Land Raider Redeemer has been a bit of a powerhouse unit for Space Marines in 10th edition. It does cost a lot of points now, but Land Raiders are just incredibly tanky and hard to crack with their 2+ saves and access to Armour of Contempt. and those big Flamestorm cannons can provide some very scary Overwatch threat in the midfield. Flamestorm aggressors could also be paired with it to deliver them into battle, move the Land Raider, pilot out the front with Assault Ramp, barbecue something with Flamers, and then hopefully charge something else. Overall, the combo's a pretty tried and tested one. Otherwise, just for more general support units, at least for current Space Marines, all of these are kind of hard to go too far wrong with. Scouts are the cheapest and most expendable of the Space Marine units, plus can deploy in the mid-board and do redeploys for secondary objectives and things. Overall, just very good value for the mission, as are infiltrators that can also threaten to midfield deploy if they need to, but against armies that have got big emphasis on reserves, just having a unit of them sat on the home field objective can add loads of reliability, as you can't deep strike within 12 inches of them, even if you have one of those 3-inch drop type special rules. Finally, jump intercessors I think are also really worth a shout. 80 points for a unit that's got quite such mobility, built-in deep strike, and a good amount of threat against enemy lighter infantry. All of those just make for a really efficient unit, and again plenty of lists tend to include a unit or two of them to bounce around doing secondary objectives. Finally, for specific unit shout-outs, Hellblasters aren't as well known for the Salamanders compared with Melter or Flamer, but they just seem to be pretty much the archetypical new player Space Marine unit that's a good pickup. Loads of points per the money, big exciting plasma weapons that just deal okay damage against anything that you fire at, and I've got that Fires in Death special rule that can be really quite impactful against enemies moving up, and gives you a bit of a reward for getting them killed as well. So fairly easy to use, giving you a reward even if they're slain. Feels like they're really going to be a particularly bad unit to have access to in a Space Marine army. Otherwise, just in general when collecting Space Marines, I'd say there's always a fair bit of scope for more or less just collecting what you like the look and feel of. 40k rules do change over time, both with codex updates and balance changes, and to be honest, chasing the meta for Space Marines can be a bit of a fool's errand really. They've just got such a massive wide array of units that a top list from one edition to the next could be entirely different with all different units. At least for a newer player, I'd say one of the main things to focus on is maybe just getting a few more mainline damage dealers. With a lot of starter sets for Space Marines, there can be an element of getting lots of guys with bolters or stuff that's nice at destroying lighter infantry units, but then winds up being a bit mediocre in terms of the damage output against an army of tanks or walkers or something like that. So you just need to make sure that you think about at least a few things that can provide a bit of dedicated anti-tank, whether it's some elite infantry with loads of power fists that damage 2, big tank busting shots like a Gladiator Lancer, or some nicely general purpose melee and big heavy plasma like a Redemptor Dreadnought. There's lots of ways that you can do that. In any case, I'd have a goal of a rough 2000 point army list in your mind, and then build towards that, gradually getting in games as you go. Finally, talking a bit more about rules, I thought we'd zero in on the Firestorm Assault Force, this one being the thematic Salamanders detachment for 10th edition. Running through its options quickly, the core rule is close range eradication. Ranged weapons all gain assault, so you advance and shoot with everything. Great for gaining range and line of sight on anything, and not compromising between pushing towards objectives and throwing down a bunch of firepower. It's particularly good for close range weapons like Melters and Flamers in particular, as they absolutely love both bits of this, getting the assault keyword, and then also the second part of the rule, which is +1 strength within 12 inches when you're making a ranged attack. This one won't always translate directly into a +1 to wound, but whenever it does, it's massive. Pretty much any of the Flamer profiles enjoy it really quite a lot. Things like Infernus Marines going to a strength 6, and Melter going from strength 9 to strength 10 is a really big breakpoint as well. There's lots of common vehicle profiles that are toughness 10 out there. Otherwise, for stratagems, you've got your standard Armour of Contempt, nice for worsening AP against your tough stuff, particularly transports, which this detachment also favours. It maybe was a bit of a curious choice that they decided to sort of smash the Salamanders force and a transport assault sort of army together, but I feel like the result really isn't too bad. They do have some fun transport tricks. Burning Vengeance means that an enemy shoots at a transport, then your unit promptly gets back out and fires straight back. Kind of terrifying sometimes if you've got something like a big unit of Hellblasters or Flamer Aggressors or Eradicators in a unit. Potentially your opponent could be warded off even shooting your transport. Crucible of Battle is a Salamander's staple, +1 to wound for an infantry unit when you shoot or fight against the closest eligible target. +1 to wound is great against all sorts of things, though massively impactful against really tough stuff that you might have been wounding on a 5. Nice for things like mid-strength power fists or blade guard weapons. Rapid Embargation is another transport shenanigan, having a unit jump back into a transport at the end of a fight phase ready to be taken somewhere new, or just to be not within gun range of enemy units and keep the unit safe. Immolation Protocols is 2 command points with torrent weapons gaining devastating wounds, This one's a massive threat, but at 2 CP it does need to be used on the right unit. Maxed out Flamestorm Aggressors, maybe Land Raider Redeemers with Vulcan Hestan, or Infernus Marines with Vulcan Hestan really seem like the ones that you want to go for that. Finally, for 1 command point, Onslaught of Fire is another option for a damage boost after you've got out of a transport. If you fire at a unit within 12 inches, then your squad gets +1 to hit, and if you destroy an enemy model, they have to take a battle shock test as well. Most of the time that's going to be redundant versus the Crucible of Battle, but on occasion it makes more sense, and you might be able to combine the two if you're feeling very spendy. Finally, for the enhancements, War Tempered Artifice is 25 points and gives you +3 strength to melee weapons for a character. 25 points really is a bit too pricey for that in my book though, even if it is fun to have, say, a Strength 11 Power Fist on the go. The Adamantium Mantle gives you -1 damage to attacks against the bearer for 20 points, plus anything Melter or Torrent only do 1 damage against the unit as well, which is kind of fun. This one maybe could be one to go for the Combi Weapon Lieutenant if you just want a lone operative that's spectacularly annoyingly tanky. It stacks rather painfully for the enemy with his Feel No Pain. Then we've got the 2 ones that I think are better. Champion of Humanity is nice and cheap at just 10 points, and this allows you to ignore all modifiers to the characteristics of rolls and tests that they make. If you do have a Tacticus armoured character leading a scary damage dealer squad, then this feels kind of auto-include if you've got the 10 points left over. Maybe nice for a lieutenant with a big squad of Hellblasters, or maybe a lieutenant or captain with some Blade Guard perhaps. In general though, I still would say that one's certainly playing second fiddle to Forged in Battle, which is the best one. While you're leading a unit, each turn you get to change 1 hit roll or saving throw to an automatic 6 after rolling, and that just means that you get absolutely guaranteed extra hits on the enemy targets, or guaranteed to turn 1 failed save into a pass save, and that can be a really big deal when you can choose it to impact, say, a really big damage hit that would have slain a Space Marine. Really good feeling when you have a big shot that would have killed something like an Aggressor or a Terminator, and then just stand that model back up again essentially. It doesn't hurt on the hit rolls either, particularly for lieutenants with lethal hits, where it means that you can essentially get 1 more auto wound. That one's easily top priority, and I'd make efforts to have that included in the army. Just looking at a few strong units for that detachment, as mentioned, the core detachment rule mainly favours close range firepower units. It really can't be understated too much that Eradicators absolutely love this. Their short range is their main weakness, struggling to hit the units they most want to attack, and then getting strength 10 against battle tanks means they go from great anti-tank to even better. They're going to be converting a whole ton of their hits and wounds, and they certainly can ride in transports like a repulsor. Flamestorm Aggressors would also be one of the single best picks I think as torrent users. In the formation within 12 inches they're going to have strength 5, AP- twin linked firepower with the assault keywords to be able to get more things in range. They can make great use of Crucible of Battle both at range and in melee, and also 6 of them on average do around about 7 or so devastating wounds if you budget in that torrent strat and maximally roll for it. It's always a pretty big deal when you can convert essentially anti-infantry weapons into things that will take a massive chunk out of heavy tanks too. Never mind if all those power fists go on to get to work. For other notable things, Inceptors like the Strength Boost and Crucible of Battle access, all very good for close range firepower as they drop in. Devastators work better in this detachment than basically anywhere else, particularly Strength 10 Multi-Melters jumping out of Razorbacks I think. They use the transport things very nicely and the Strength 10 and the Assault keyword, plus also could be good with Vulcan Hestan once they're on the board if they survive. Infernus Marines enjoy Strength 6 Flamers with the Assault keyword, again a good target for the Torrent strat. Otherwise you could name just about any other ranged unit that enjoys the advance and shoot access. It's still impactful for more gunline battle tanks, things like Vindicators being able to advance and shoot, or Gladiator Lancers trying to draw a bead on a key target. For transport units, I still feel like the Land Raider Redeemer is pretty standout awesome. It's kind of interesting in it's both a unit that can have massive impact with its own shooting and overwatch, and also can transport a scary unit around, delivering them to either shooting or melee or both. Plus works great with Vulcan Hestan as well if you're running him. Multi-melters and big flamestorm cannons love rerolls to wound. The standard repulsor might be my next best pick. A large transport capacity could get all sorts of shooting shenanigans off with things like Hellblasters or Eradicators. It's nicely tough at 180 points for 16 wounds of toughness 12 as well. The impulse is very interesting too, and you could use it as Hellblasters, Infernus Marines or Blade Guard for a battlefield taxi. Quite nice in that they can shoot out the top as well if that makes more sense. Otherwise literally any other transport unit does far better here than elsewhere. Rhinos, Razorbacks, maybe even drop pods to deliver some close range fire, or even the mighty Stormraven gunship. Not really Salamanders, but it's probably worth giving the Black Templars tanks a shout out here as well. Impulsors with a multi-melter just work extra well in Firestorm with things like Advance and Shoot and Strength 10 on offer. Finally, for character choices, for standout things, I certainly feel like that Forged in Battle trait just seems like literally whatever you put that on, that's going to make a damage dealer unit that little bit tougher and a little bit more dangerous. Well worth 15 points if it saves a single Marine, but otherwise compared with generally effective things like Lieutenants, Combi Weapon Lieutenants, or the Apothecary Biologist, I would say that Captains may be a bit better in the Firestorm Assault Force versus the most other detachments as well. Just being able to use Crucible of Battle each turn gives you a reliable offensive way to use them every time, and they can always fall back on Armor of Contempt or think about re-rolling charge rolls if necessary as well. They're still maybe one of the best ways to use that Torrent stratagem if you really want to. Put a Gravis Captain in a unit of Flamestorm aggressors, and then the stratagem will only cost 1 command point. It isn't quite as good as prior to the last balance update though, where you could get it entirely for free. Otherwise, I do feel that both of the Salamanders characters actually have a lot of synergy with this detachment. Adrax does well with Blade Guard, +1 to wounds from Crucible of Battle when you need it, and then 4 reroll wound rolls from Adrax means they're going to be stacking a whole ton of wounds with OK AP and damage, and Vulcan could combo with either Land Raider Redeemers or Infernus Marines, and again the Infernus Marines could be an interesting choice for a whole bunch of devastating wounds. Finally, just putting that all together in one rough Salamanders Firestorm army list. This one's mainly aiming to put a bunch of scary units and transports on the board and give the enemy a good burning at close range with Melter and Flamer. In this one, there's basically 4 big damage dealer units in the army. Ajax Agatone is going to be running with a unit of Blade Guard, and he's going to be in an Impulsor, using that as a battlefield taxi to get into the mid-board and then have a bunker to be charging out of. As mentioned, with 4 rerolls and Crucible of Battle, that squad can hit phenomenally hard. There's then a unit of Eradicators with Flamestorm Gauntlets joined by Gravis Captain with Forged in Battle, and they're all going to be in a Land Raider Redeemer for some spectacular Overwatch threats, but mainly just to get them up the board very quickly, burn something down and then charge something else, and they could be a nice target of the devastating Wound Torrent stratagem. Then we've got a big chunky unit of 6 Eradicators in a Repulsor. They'll be the primary scary anti-tank threat of the army. Ideally use the transport to get into range and put down those melter rifles with enormous rerolls against the biggest scariest enemy unit in the midfield. Though if they don't happen to be fighting against any armor, they could be using Vulcan Estan's rerolls to keep them really reliable against other targets as well. The Repulsor can protect them against charging, contributes a whole bunch of volume fire in its own right, and could also be nice with some transport tricks such as the Get Out and Shoot one. Finally, we've got a unit of 10 Infernus Marines in a drop pod. They'll be able to reliably jump in and put down 10d6 strength 6 shots on enemy units, potentially with 4 rerolls from Vulcan Hestan as well. He'll be trekking up the board along with a unit of company heroes to put an unusually tanky squad in the mid-board. They've still got a good bit of melee threat, and then use the unit's good objective control to basically have that as your objective until they're dealt with. He can spot for the Infernus Marines, which again could use the devastating Torrent one, though it would cost a pricey 2 CP, so maybe a little bit less likely there. But also in particular the Land Raider Redeemer, those Flamestorm cannons can kill most things if you've got reroll wounds with them. Finally, just to back that all up with a little bit of objective support, there's 2 units of 5 scouts with missile launchers, sniper, chainsword and bolters. They can screen back the enemy or just be annoying nuisance trading units in the midboard to do secondaries and things. And then 1 unit of infiltrators that could also add to midboard threat if it made more sense, but more likely just sit on the home field objective and stop enemy reserves getting anywhere near it. Between all those units, I feel like there's enough things that are a massive handful to deal with and can deal spectacular damage. With stratagems focused on them, that you should have some good options. Maybe one weakness could be just how stretched command points could be. Lots of things that could credibly get great value out of them, everything from Armor of Contempt to Crucible of Battle and devastating wounds, plus transport tricks. You would have some very big decisions to make as to how to invest the command points to deliver victory in the game. In any case, it's more there for the general idea and feel of it, as opposed to super ridiculously tournament optimized or anything. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Hopefully that's given a few ideas as to how you might start a Salamanders army in 40k 10th edition. As always, if you have any other hints, tips or experience for playing, feel free to leave them down in the comments. If you'd like something else to watch, then I'll leave a link to my Space Marine unit tier list video. I'll leave that down in the video description. And feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help out and support all the content. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.